Where's your playlist taking you? Down the highway? To the mountains? Or just into daydream mode while you're stuck in traffic? With over 4,000 hotels worldwide, Best Western is there to help you make the most of your getaway, wherever that is. Because the only thing better than a great playlist is a great trip. Life's the trip. Make the most of it at Best Western. Book direct and save at bestwestern.com.
You were scrolling down memory lane when you accidentally tapped your ex's post from years ago. Better delete the whole app. When scrolling's a bust, tacos are a must. Paso, the old El Paso.
Pick up an old El Paso stand and stuffed taco kit today.
When modern life gets rough, grab the timeless taste you love. Paso, the old El Paso.
Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances, the podcast where we take you down the rabbit hole into the fantastic world of the strange, the paranormal, and the unknown. I'm Morgan Knudsen. Come along with me on this week's adventure. Well, last week, you guys, we had the incredible Jim Harold on to kick into spooky season, and nobody does it better, really. I mean, he's so fantastic, and we're going to continue the tradition of strange stories, because that's what we're getting excited about, right? I mean, it's coming up on Halloween season. This is probably one of the most exciting times of year for people like us who just love this stuff. And I couldn't think of anybody better to have on than my good friend, Dr. Dean Bertram. And for those of you guys who don't know Dean, he hosts an incredible podcast called Talking Weird. And I highly recommend go subscribe to it. He's brilliant. And he's got a short film that's out in the festival circuit right now called The Shaver Mystery. And it's so interesting. But it takes place around the idea of a fellow by the name of Richard Shaver and ufology. And ufology is where we are going today. And we're going to be talking about the Maury Island Incident. Now, when many people think of UFOs, we think about Roswell, we think about events that really hit the news, maybe post 1950, 1947. And the Maury Island Incident is not only one of the most significant events in ufology history, but also is the alleged beginning of the Men in Black sightings. Now, if you guys listened to the last episode, you know this is kind of a topic that's near and dear to me, and I'm really interested to get to the bottom of what this means. What does this mean for ufology? Was the Maury Island Incident even real? Dean's the guy we got to talk to. So, if you guys are ready, let's get this going.
Make your next vacation unforgettable. On Royal Caribbean's newest ship, Star of the Seas. It's everything you've loved about every family vacation you've ever been on, with mind-blowing thrills at the largest water park at sea, 7 onboard pools for every level of chill, more than 40 ways to dine and drink, and even more to enjoy at our award-winning private island, Perfect Day at Coco Cay. This is the new Star of the Seas. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
This episode is brought to you by Marshalls, where you never have to compromise between quality and price. The buyers at Marshalls hustle hard, working to bring you great deals on brand name and designer pieces. Because Marshalls believes everyone deserves access to the good stuff. Visit a Marshalls store near you or shop online at marshalls.com.
Abercrombie Kids is bringing the ultimate first day energy back to school. It all starts with on-trend outfits for that front door photo shoot. Plus, the coolest tees, shorts, and jeans to take them through the rest of the year. Get them ready for their close-up and keep them comfy too. Make this grade their best one yet. Shop all things back to school, in-store, online, and in the app.
Well, this is going to be such a fun conversation because I did not know much about Maury Island until you introduced me to this, Dean. And I realized I have a lot to be interested about Maury Island because I feel like I've got a bit of a connection to it, which we'll talk about later. thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me on. I always love chatting to you, whether it's on my show or especially when I get to visit you. I'd rather, to be honest, I'd much rather be asked the questions than ask them, because then I can just, it's easier to answer than to ask questions, I think. I can just rant then. I don't have to be all thoughtful. I'm just like, blah, 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 this is what I know about Maury Island, blah, 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 blah.
Well, that's fair. I am, yeah, and it's always an honor to have you on, because like you, I so enjoy talking with you, and every time that you're on or I'm on your show, it's just a conversation that's always so good.
So great.
Maury Island is something that I know was somewhat new to me, because I'm not massively into the ufology field, but I'm sure listeners are kind of wondering about it as well if they're not totally delved into that area. Let's get into this. What is the Maury Island Incident? It's Washington, right?
Washington State, off the coast of Tacoma, and Puget Sound is where it's located. So the water just to the west of Tacoma and Seattle is a body of water called the Puget Sound, and it lies between the mainland and Maury Island. And this is where the incident started, I suppose.
This is such a wild story, and I didn't realize how much fundamentally that it has to do with launching the understanding of so many phenomena that we talk about all the time,
right?
Which is massive. So I'm just gonna let you go. Take us through the Maury Island incident. What happened, and how did this play out?
Sure. I guess I'll preface it by saying it's like many incidents of the paranormal. It's difficult to sometimes gauge what's real and what's not real, and what's fabricated and what's not. And certainly many people have suggested the Maury Island incident is a hoax. But I will tell the narrative as it was carried by ufology. And so let's put all, belief and doubt aside for a moment. So on June 21, 1947, which, to contextualize that date, was 3 days before Kenneth Arnold had his sighting of flying saucers near Mount Rainier. And that is what kicked off the modern flying saucer era. That's where the term came from, at least the term when it was applied to out of space, craft supposedly visiting us. So this is 3 days before Kenneth Arnold's sighting, again, supposedly. And on the Puget Sound, which, as I said before, is the body of water between the coast of Tacoma and Seattle on the west coast, on Washington State, as you mentioned, and Maury Island, there was essentially a lumber salvageman called Harold Dahl operating a boat with 2 crew members and his son and the family dog. And I suppose their job was to go and look for lumber that had fallen off, boats which were shipping lumber, and then they would salvage it and they would sell it back to lumber companies. Apparently it was something that people, did at the time. Anyway, they're out doing this job, and all of a sudden they notice in the sky above them essentially a flying saucer, although it was really a flying donut is the way they described it, because there was a hole in the middle of this craft. And this craft seemed to be in trouble. It was kind of wavering in the air, kind of shaking back and forth. And there were these other flying donuts. I think in total there were 6, and other ones seemed to be coming to its aid, circling this craft as if to provide some kind of assistance. And out of the donut hole, what appeared to be some type of metallic slag or debris started to be emitted by the craft, by the flying donut. And it was hitting the water in the Puget Sound, steam was coming up, and then as it started to travel closer to the boat, supposedly this debris started to hit the boat. Now, allegedly it injured Harold Dahl's son, it hit his son's arm, allegedly some of it killed the family dog, and so they motored the boat as fast as they could to the shore of Maury Island. They all bailed out of the boat and they went and hid behind lumber that was on Maury Island until eventually this craft kind of stabilized with the help of the other 5 flying donuts around it, and it flew off, or they all flew off into the distance. Now, they piloted their boat back to Tacoma, and again, there's all these aspects of the story where nobody's quite sure of, but the original narrative suggested that Harold Dahl's boss was a man called Fred Chrisman, and Fred Chrisman is this fascinating, mysterious figure that we could do an entire show on alone, and maybe we'll talk about some of the weirdness of Fred Chrisman.
I think that's a must.
Yeah, it's almost unavoidable. So when they take it to Fred Chrisman and he looks at the boat and they say, they've damaged it. At first, supposedly Chrisman thought, well, maybe they were drunk and they were stupid. He doesn't believe the story. But then again, according to Fred Chrisman, he looks at the boat and he looks at the top of the boat, the roof of the boat, and there's holes above. So it's not like they drove it. I mean, I'm assuming there was some damage where they drove it into the shoreline where they beached it, but there was all this damage above, which kind of fit the story of what Harold Dale had told Fred Chrisman. And so Fred Chrisman goes out to the area himself. I think maybe it's the following day. He goes out to Maury Island, and he sure enough finds debris which matches what they were saying on the shoreline, and he sees a flying donut himself, which seems to be scouting the area. And that's kind of the setup for the story. There's much more, and it keeps going, but maybe I'll pause there in case you have any questions. And that's the beginning of the Maury Island incident.
Well, of course I've got questions. It's so wild, and one of the things that makes this really interesting to me is that here we've got something that is, maybe not quite the equivalent of a Roswell type incident, but this is a pretty big deal. Nobody's seemingly covering it the same way Roswell was being covered. This was I find that very strange, and so that might be a topic for in a little bit. But so who were the witnesses? So you mentioned a fellow named Harold. So who was all involved in this?
Okay, so it was Harold Dale initially. We don't know the names of his two crew men, okay, assuming they existed. His son, apparently after the incident, and this is part of the story too, vanishes. It's like a David Paulides story. He vanishes and he appears in, I think, somewhere like Idaho, totally losing his memory, working in a diner somewhere.
What?
So, yeah, this is another weird part of the extension of the story. Fred Chrisman is a fascinating character, and Fred Chrisman first appears in the realm of the paranormal and the strange and the unusual and the weird and the anomalous a number of years before. And this is actually a key part of the story. Fred Chrisman writes to a publication called Amazing Stories, which is probably my primary wheelhouse at the moment. A man called Ray Palmer was he was the editor, as if Davis were the publishers, but Ray Palmer was the editor of a magazine called Amazing Stories, which was America's leading science fiction pulp magazine in the 1940s. And at the time when Fred Chrisman wrote, in the mid-40s, Ray Palmer had begun to run a series of stories which he labelled the Shaver Mystery. And while this was a science fiction magazine, the Shaver Mystery stories were written by a man called Richard Shaver, who claimed to have had genuine contact with an underground race or races of alien beings, a race of beings called the Dero, which stood in Shaver's language for detrimental robot. It was a shortening of detrimental robot. It didn't mean they were robotic. D or det meant detrimental, essentially. So they were evil, and that was what the D meant. And the Ro, there was a shortening of robot, but in Shaver's language, that just meant it was the main force that controlled you. So the Dero were controlled primarily by detrimental forces. So all they wanted to do was hurt, maim, kill, rape. That was their game. And they interfered with the surface. They had rays that they shot up towards the surface, which could send, bad ideas into your brain. They could crash, planes with this thing. They could cause all kinds of trouble, and they constantly did. The Dero were essentially the devils and the demons of history. They were the things which interfered with us. There was another race down there as well, but we'll stick with the Dero for the time being, because this has to do with Fred Chrisman's first contact with Amazing Stories and with Ray Palmer. So he writes a couple of letters to Ray Palmer during the height of the Shaver Mystery, because the Shaver Mystery stories drove Amazing Stories to an all-time high circulation of essentially 250,000 issues, which was unthinkable at the time. this was crazy for any pulp magazine, let alone a science fiction pulp magazine. And that's a whole other story into itself, which I think we've talked about a little bit maybe before, you and I, but just that there was a big furor in science fiction between the hardcore science fiction fans who didn't like this kind of weird occult, new agey, wasn't called new age then, but, UFO-y type stuff, and just the general readership, which were like, these stories are fascinating, that Richard Shaver's saying. Anyway, there was always a lot of letters to the editor, and a couple of those came from Fred Chrisman. Chrisman, in his first letter, essentially said that when he was a fighter pilot in World War II, so I think maybe 45, 46, he'd been shot down in Burma and had landed on an island, and there was a cave system there, and he'd essentially got into a battle with the Darrow. And the Darrow, I think, had shot at him with a ray gun or something and left a hole in his arm, or maybe killed his friend. The details don't matter that much, but the point is Fred Chrisman had already been in contact with Ray Palmer a couple times about his supposed own encounters with the Darrow, which wasn't that unusual in Amazing Stories at the time. A lot of people were writing and claiming to have heard the voices which Richard Shaver heard, or to have been in the cavern system, or to have encountered something which seemed to back up the stories that Richard Shaver was writing and Ray Palmer was publishing in Amazing Stories. But flash forward to the Maury Island incident. And this is the reason, and you mentioned before, and I can kind of answer two questions for you, because you mentioned before how now everybody knows about Roswell, but few people talk about the Maury Island incident. The great irony, of course, is up until the late 70s, the early 80s, nobody in the UFO field talked about the Roswell incident at all, because after the incident, and it went out in the news services that the US Army Air Force had captured this, crash saucer in, early July of 1947, the US Army Air Force redacted the story almost straight away and said, no, this isn't, or retracted it and said, no, this isn't what happened. And then it was forgotten. Ufology left it alone. But because Ray Palmer, which I'm about to talk about a little, who got involved with the story, was the major, perhaps, publisher of flying saucer stories and flying saucer materials, arguably from the 40s all the way into the 60s, he had put so much emphasis on the Maury Island story that there was a period where if you'd asked a ufologist or somebody interested in the UFO story back in the 50s or 60s, what's Roswell, they would have gone, I don't know. But if you asked them what's the Maury Island incident, they would have known what the Maury Island incident was. And that probably continued up until Roswell took over. Like I have two UFO encyclopedias behind me here. I think one's from Ronald Story, one's from Margaret Sachs. Both of them published in 1980. I don't believe either of them even mentioned the word Roswell because it would have been all but forgotten. But Maury Island would be mentioned, I'm almost sure, in both of those because it was such a big story. So anyway, that kind of fills perhaps your listeners in on the importance of Fred Chrisman, because Fred Chrisman already had a weird relationship with Ray Palmer. Not that they were buddies or anything, but he'd certainly been in contact before. And so when he recovered this material, who did he send it to? He sent it to the editor of Amazing Stories, Ray Palmer.
Right.
And Ray Palmer's, who already thought that the flying saucer mystery, that had just started, because supposedly Maury Island happened, as I said, on June 21. They didn't send it to him on June 22. They didn't send it to him until after Kenneth Arnold's sighting on June 24. So by the time that it was sent to him, and so then the argument becomes, well, maybe the Maury Island thing's a hoax and people are trying to cash in on Kenneth Arnold's sighting. But when they send it to Ray Palmer, he's aware of the sources, as a whole country is aware of the sources. But to him and to Richard Shaver, this is proof of what they've been writing about in Amazing Stories since the mid-40s, since about 1944. This is proof of the caves, because Richard Shaver wrote about aliens from space visiting the people in the caves, the people from caves having this advanced technology which sounds very much like flying saucers. So they were already like, this is the Shaver mystery come to life. And interestingly, the June 1947 issue of Amazing Stories, which was already on the newsstands before Kenneth Arnold's sighting, before the Maury Island incident, was the All Shaver Mystery Special. Now, Amazing Stories had already really become the All Shaver Mystery magazine anyway, because that was the major focus of the magazine.
Sure,
All this issue was stories by Richard Shaver and people writing things which backed up what Richard Shaver was saying. And one of the pieces in that All Shaver Mystery mystery issue in June of 1947 was a piece by the great Fortean Vincent Gaddis, who used to write for Amazing Stories, a piece called Visitors from the Void. Now, he didn't have the term flying saucers to use yet, but he wrote a piece in that, and this is before Kenneth Arnold's sighting, essentially talking about various sightings of things in the skies, which were probably from outer space, which were probably extraterrestrial. So that was on the newsstands. This magazine, which had reached 250,000 circulation, was there before Kenneth Arnold had his sighting and before what happened at Maury Island, if it happened at Maury Island, actually happened. So anyway, Fred Chrisman sends this material to Ray Palmer, and Ray Palmer realizes this is a heck of a story. So Ray Palmer, being the great editor that he was, the great, almost Barnum-esque, carnival shouter that he was.
Yeah, when I think of him, that's exactly what I think of, is kind of like this like carnival barker in a magazine. A little bit, like he would pick up on these stories. Like, it was so interesting.
Yeah, he was great. He knew how to publicize. I think he was very sincere in a lot of what he did, but he had a great taste or a great sensibility for what would become a popular story. So who does he contact? This is genius. He contacts Kenneth Arnold, the first flying saucer witness who's already, captured attention of America, probably definitely the most famous flying saucer witness on the planet, and asks Kenneth Arnold, who already lives in the Pacific Northwest, he's Idaho-based, he's a private pilot, so he can fly to Maury Island and investigate. And he asks Kenneth Arnold, will you go and investigate Maury Island for me? And Arnold agrees. Yeah, I think there's different versions of how much Palmer paid him. It's either $200 or I've also heard $500. And Arnold went and investigated. And when Arnold investigates, it's when the story kind of blows up. It's when it becomes crazier and we start to get so many more of the tropes that we have in modern ufology, because of course we've already got the first really modern idea of flying saucer wreckage, flying saucer wreckage retrieval, again before Roswell. Whether it's real or not, it's still before Roswell, right? It's meant to be June 21. Roswell doesn't happen until July, 4th or something like that, at 47. So we've got the beginnings of modern UFO mythology, the beginning of crash saucer debris. But when Arnold goes there, all these other things start opening up.
Okay, what happened?
Well, so Arnold flies in. Interestingly, he sees more flying saucers on his way there, supposedly, he had a number of sightings of saucers throughout his life, which aren't often talked about. We only ever talk about that initial sighting over Mount Rainier. Speaking of Mount Rainier, it's worth saying that Mount Rainier, which everybody knows is the mountain closest to where Kenneth Arnold, when he was piloting his plane, first had saw 9 crescent-shaped craft, which he didn't describe them as saucers, but crescent-shaped craft in June 24 of 1947. When you're standing on Maury Island and you look back towards Seattle, Tacoma, Mount Rainier looms in the background. Like it's so present. It's such an obvious part of the consciousness of if you lived there. So clearly Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman, if they'd heard they'd heard the Kenneth Arnold story, were looking up at this mountain every day. So flying saucers would have been part of their consciousness. Or alternatively, if you believe Maury Island was a genuine incident, and it may very well have been, this isn't very far from where Arnold sees the saucers 3 days later. So depending what way you look at it, there's a clear geographical connection between the original flying saucer famous Kenneth Arnold story and the Maury Island incident, which supposedly predates it for 3 days. So what we now I've gone off on a weird little tangent. So we were talking about just hit me again with
sure. Yeah, basically I think what's interesting to me about this is that as this has gone along, as these people were sort of amassing this information and they're trying to figure it out, and I think at this point the world is starting to try to want to figure this out. What's interesting to me is that, I mean, we know a little bit more nowadays about how consciousness works, and there's been that tie-in between our consciousness versus what we're witnessing on a paranormal level. Like I had on a fellow about a year ago, and we were talking about the Kenneth Arnold sighting. And what was really interesting about that to me was he and you kind of touched on it, was that he never actually described it as a flying saucer. It was the media that took it and described it as a flying saucer. And then everybody started to see flying saucers. But what was interesting was that the author that I was talking with, he actually saw one as well. And so he was not a disbeliever in this by any stretch of the imagination, but he actually witnessed one of these things showing up. I believe it was in Spain. And what I find really interesting about this is that you've got all this attention that's on it. And now all of a sudden people are seeing stuff, or they think they're seeing something. And the interesting part to me about this story, and I think where it gets a little bit past, okay, everybody's looking at this, and reading magazines about it, now we're seeing flying saucers, is that there was debris that it was actually found. And there was... They picked up this slag, and they found some really interesting things about it in terms of its makeup and the calcium in it and whatnot. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because it sort of pulls, for me, it pulls this out of the realm of hoax, or what is this, to what is it that got picked up?
Right. Ray Palmer had some testing done on the debris that was sent to him. As I mentioned, that's who Chrisman sends it to originally. I think you're right. I think it's the levels of calcium in it are indicative of the type of metallic structure that would be used to protect people from radioactive waves, which would be the same type of material used in spacesuits and used in nuclear reactor, shielding and things like that. Interestingly, there is a piece of it left. A piece of it is still in the hands of Raymond B. Palmer, Ray Palmer's son, who lives near me. I've held what may be the last, publicly held piece of the Maury Island Incident debris, because it's funny. There's a UFO Hunters show, and it might even be the first episode with Bill Burns, who used to be the editor of UFO magazine. I think it's a fun show, but they go to Maury Island and they go like scuba diving, and they're looking in the forest to try to, to find some of this material, because of course this is another part of the story. Another plane crashes, which is carrying some debris, and we can get into that maybe, but they're looking madly for this debris. And I'm like, you just go and knock on Raymond B. Palmer's door and he'll pull out the piece. You don't have to be diving in, Puget Sound, or going through the woodland in where the Air Force plane went down, which was carrying it. And again, whatever the reality of it, there was a very weird potency when I held that piece of metal in my hand. I've held it a couple times now because I visited Raymond A. Palmer's son, because he lives not very far from me, and he's let me hold the debris a couple times. And if you're into UFO history like I am, whatever the reality of this story is, it's like holding a piece of the Holy Grail almost. Like, this is the first UFO crash story of the flying saucer era. And when you I remember the first time I held it in my hand, because I'd written about this all the way back in my PhD.
Sure.
A couple decades before, and I'm holding this thing, not knowing that he had. No, well, I did know. I'd heard rumors that he had it, but when I visited him, he pulls it out, and I'm like holding it, and he's like, "You can hold it for a little while if you want," because I'm just stunned, like looking at this thing. Oh, So it's wonderful. Some of this material exists. Apparently it's been shipped out a number of times because there have been a number of tests still done on it, and a lot of these tests are never properly conclusive. Like, I think people always want to hope there's some proof that it's extraterrestrial, but how on earth do you prove that?
Yeah. I think that's really fascinating, because there's been so many cases over the years that probably fall on my list of the most interesting in terms of ufology, where you hear about these small towns, for instance, that all of a sudden get dumped on by something, whether it be like goo or strange substances, and then people are getting sick from these substances, and then they're seeing these weird crafts in the air, and then all of a sudden some sort of agency sweeps in and cleans it. Like, it's so bizarre. And here in Alberta, we actually have a few of cases similar to that ended up getting tied back to the government, which is a sort of a long story. But I find it so interesting when this stuff is actually recovered, because it does bring it out of the realm of, okay, people were drunk on the boat and maybe had a few many to something happened, right? Like something went on, something happened. So, but this story takes a really interesting turn as well. What was it? The next day, they get a visitor.
That's what you were asking before. What happened with Kenneth Arnold when he went there as well? And I got sidetracked with the Mount Rainier story. So what if we look at how the story rolls out? And this is before Arnold gets here, and then I'll get back to what you asked about Arnold. I think that's what you asked. But the next day, Harold Dahl receives a visit from essentially what we would call now a man in black. It's the first time in modern history that a man in black appears. Harold Dahl is visited by a man wearing the traditional black suit, the black tie, the black hat, and it describes to or tells Harold, we know exactly what you saw, and kind of describes what he saw. We need to go away and talk about this, and not where your family is. I think he visits Dahl at his house. And so they go to a diner or somewhere like that nearby, a cafe or something. And then he tells him everything that Dahl saw. And he says, if you know what's good for you and what's good for your family, you won't tell anybody about this, which is classic Men in Black behavior.
Sure.
This is the beginning of it. Like, we haven't had a Man in Black story before this. Now, Harold Dahl doesn't do that because they contact Ray Palmer with the debris, but this is one of the reasons that Dahl thought his son disappeared, that this was somehow some part of some government payback, eventually, or some secret payback. Dahl, when Kenneth Arnold, and this is what you were asking before, when Kenneth Arnold visits and investigates, he goes to visit Dahl, and Dahl takes him to a house which is set up like an office. Supposedly Dahl has a secretary in there, and it's all very, very strange and too convoluted to talk about now. But when when Arnold leaves and he goes back to the house, there's nothing there. It's totally empty. It's like it had been set up just for Dahl's benefit the night that he visited. There's nobody there at all.
What the hell?
Yeah, and that's in the Coming of the Saucers book, which is one of the very first flying saucer books. Not the first, but one of the very early ones, written by Kenneth Arnold and Ray Palmer. And it's certainly worth reading for anybody who has an interest in this type of material, because Ray Palmer wrote it with Arnold, and I think some people have argued that Ray Palmer might have done most of the writing. Ray Palmer had been a science fiction writer and a science fiction editor by this stage of his life for, well over 15 years. He knew how to make a story exciting and interesting, and you wonder how much some of the details might have been spun.
Hey.
Certainly, we know there's changes in the date to make the story more interesting, like Palmer kind of condensed and changed some of the dates and things, but still that story is in the book. So there's all this very weird James Bondy type stuff, and parts of the book does read like a spy thriller. Like, Kenneth Arnold calls in a friend of his, Captain Smith, who was another very famous early UFO witness. I don't know what airline he was a pilot of, but a major US commercial airline. He was a very well-known pilot, and he'd had another very famous early sighting. In fact, there are photos of Arnold and Smith with other people looking at maps where UFO the sightings have occurred and things. They were both very well-known flying saucer witnesses, and they become buddies because of it. And so Arnold called Smith in. Smith flew in to help him. And then they shared a hotel room. The hotel room story alone is another weird story. When Arnold arrives in Tacoma, he can't find a hotel anywhere. Apparently the whole thing's booked. And he rings the best hotel in town, and they say, "Oh yes, we've got a room ready for you, Mr. Arnold." And he'd never made a booking there.
What?
So super weird. Anyway, so he stays there. His friend Smith visits, Captain Smith visits and stays there. And then they start getting calls in their room from a reporter saying, "Somebody just rang us and said you said this." And they're like, "How on earth does anybody, what?" And they get super paranoid. Like in The Coming of the Saucers, Arnold says, again, co-written by Ray Palmer, says they tore apart the room looking for bugs. They couldn't find anything. And he gets so freaked out, Arnold says, "I was really glad that I brought my handgun with me because I slept with it under my pillow." Like, he got really scared.
Wow. And I mean,
sorry, go on.
no, I was just going to say, and I mean, from that coming from a military man, something's serious. Like, I think with a lot of this stuff, everything that you're describing is kind of how this stuff seems to work. Like, there's something under the surface of all of these incidents, and not just in UFOs, but in other areas as well. Like it's like there's, I don't know, like a greater orchestration that's going on. And I find that so interesting. So yeah, go ahead, continue.
No, and we should get to
Wild.
some of the synchronicities and weirdness of all these things. But so they get so freaked out because, again, remember, Arnold by now is the most famous flying saucer witness in America. He always was because he was the first, and it got carried on every news wire on the planet almost. That he already knows Air Force investigative agents who came to investigate and talk to him about his report. So he gets so freaked out. He thinks something really weird is happening in Tacoma and Maury Island. So he calls his Air Force agent, assumedly he's still got his card in his wallet, and he says, there's something weird going on here, and I'm spooked and I need your help. 2 Army Air Force agents or 2 Army Air Force officers fly in to investigate the case on Arnold's request. So this all goes back to Ray Palmer, remember. So this is how important Palmer is. Palmer initiates it by asking Arnold to investigate. Arnold gets creeped out, first asks his friend to help, then asks the Air Force in. The Air Force come in, they interview everybody. They interview Chrisman, they interview Dahl. They obviously talk to both Arnold and Smith. And apparently they're not that impressed. Also, they want to get back to base really badly because at this period in 1947, and by now it's about August of 47, like it's a couple of months after the actual, or maybe a month and a half after the actual incident, what's about to happen historically? Well, the Air Force is actually splitting from the Army. They used to be the same service. Like the Air Force was just, I guess, a brigade or whatever you would call it. It was a part of the Army. But the Air Force is becoming its own service. It's becoming Air Force states, the day they're going to celebrate their, I suppose, independence from the Army. So these 2 investigating Air Force officers want to return to their base. They're in a hurry to get back. They flew in a B. I think they just got a B-25 because they were both pilots, and they just flew in to do the investigation. And then they go, "We're going back." Like they apparently didn't think there was anything there. When they're leaving to go back, Fred Chrisman says, "No, you've got to take some debris with you. This is the proof." And they're like, "Okay." So Fred Chrisman motors away, goes and grabs some debris that he's collected on the shoreline of Maury Island, the same type of debris which he'd already sent Ray Palmer, a month and a half or so earlier. And he brings it back in a cornflake box of all things. You can imagine this, Fred Chrisman running up with a cornflakes box overflowing with, UFO debris. And they take it, they lock it supposedly in, I guess, the part of the plane where they put materials which are important. And then they take off and they fly back to base. Now, they never got back to base. Near Kelso, Washington, I believe one of the engines catches on fire. And the 2 pilots, who were the pilot and the co-pilot, who were the investigating officers, tell the other 2 Air Force people who were flying with them, because I think back in the day, and it's probably still the same today, if you wanted to move around and you were part of the armed services, you just jump on a plane which was going back to base, and it's very, okay, is everybody flying back to wherever? Yeah, we are. So they put parachutes on those guys and told them to bail, and they did bail. I think one was seriously injured still, I guess, when you parachute at a low altitude at night or something, right? Super dangerous. But the plane went down and both the investigating officers died, and they were the first 2 fatalities of the US Air Force in the history of, because the US Air Force had just become the US Air Force. So this becomes a big deal. This becomes a national security issue, right? So the FBI start to investigate. This thing all spirals. And none of this would have happened if Ray Palmer hadn't hired Kenneth Arnold, who hadn't gone out there and called his Air Force buddies in to investigate.
God, and if I'm not mistaken, too, one of them, and maybe it was Ray, said, "Don't get on the plane with this stuff."
That's right.
Like he had actually come out and said, "Do not fly with this because something is going to happen." And lo and behold, this engine they get shot at, or something happens, and down goes this airplane. Like, I mean, there's so much that's going on here that you're like, is this coincidence? I don't know. I don't believe in coincidences. It's very bizarre.
Yeah, this is like the beginning of X-Files. I always call it X-Files, UFO belief, because that's what people most understand, but the paranoid version of UFO belief, the idea of government cover-ups and, secret societies and men in black and retrieved UFO crashes, it all starts at Maury Island. And you're right, according to Ray Palmer, he had told Kenneth Arnold, do not let those men fly out of there with that wreckage, or there is going to be. Palmer supposedly just knew, but whether Palmer did actually tell Arnold or not, certainly that's what happened. I mean, certainly those men never made it back to base, which is what Palmer says that he told Kenneth Arnold.
It's wild. I think it's interesting that all of this stuff occurs, that is such a catalyst into the UFO movement that goes forward, and it makes you wonder, how many of the stories are now unknowingly based on the Maury Island incident, or is it something where the Maury Island incident happens and then people start coming forward? And I think back, and this is sort of a different genre, but back to the 1909 Jersey Devil case in New Jersey, where people were, all of a sudden it blew up in the media that there was this creature that was jumping on roofs, and the whole city gets put in lockdown basically because people are seeing this thing wandering around town. And it was often chalked up to, it's mass hysteria, like that's what's going on. But then when you go back to the indigenous writings, of course, the indigenous writings are saying, no, this is known as the place of the dragon. Like we've been seeing this thing here for a really long time. So it kind of makes you wonder, with like a case like this, what happened first, the chicken or the egg?
Right.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's the case, and it's great you brought up the Jersey Devil analogy, because there's lots of them. There's Dogman's a classic example. Before Linda Godfrey's investigations in the Beast of Bray Road, and before similar things in Michigan happened, where there was a repopularization, there's no Dogman stories in the paranormal literature seriously for a very long time. I remember asking Ken Gerhard a while ago, because I was kind of working on a book which has been long put on the back burner about some of this stuff. And he's like, no, there was, and he's I suppose one of the world's.
There was in Canada, though. There was in Canada.
Interesting.
Yeah, lots of indigenous history with Dogman here in Canada.
Well, I think you're right, and I think that's the same as Jersey Devil. I think I don't think people were. I don't think these things didn't pre-exist. But the question, the chicken and the egg point you made, is wonderful, because were people having these experiences anyway, and it's just that the media covering it made it safer to come forward, or did somehow the media attention either caused people to misidentify non-anomalous phenomenon as anomalous, or even crazier, did that attention in the human, subconscious somehow let these things come out more? When people are thinking about them, do they somehow emerge more? If you've got stories on Fox News all of a sudden, or wherever, then are more people aware of it, and are they more likely to have an encounter with something like it? It's a very weird, and that chicken and the egg analogy is absolutely right. Like, it's what is it? How does it work?
Yeah, and I don't know if there's necessarily an answer to that, because there's so much of consciousness that's tied into the UFO phenomenon, to of course the parapsychology phenomenon, and whatever. But what I find really interesting about this story, among many other things, is the Man in Black aspect to it, because I had my own Man in Black encounter a couple of years ago, and it was amazing.
You should tell me that. I've never heard you tell that story.
You've never heard me tell that story. I told it in the last episode. So once people have probably heard this a million times. So when we get off the air, I'll tell you the story.
I can go back and listen as well.
But it was so interesting, and it was very benign, like very positive. It was never anything negative, but it was absolutely real. And so I hear stories like this, and I think to myself, like, if this was the beginning of the phenomenon, what exactly does that mean? Were these beings around beforehand? Who are they? I guess there's a lot of theory out there as to what they are. I'd love to hear your take on what you think they are, who you think they are.
You're right. There's lots of historical antecedents, I suppose. I wish I could remember his name. There's an academic who did his PhD dissertation. I used to own the dissertation. I bought it back when I was doing my own. About correlates in history of the Men in Black phenomenon. So people encountering, strange men in dark suits knocking on their doors, and this ties in with all kinds of things like vampire mythology and even modern, black-eyed children lore, where these things which don't really seem like us. I think a lot of people are confused with Men in Black now for a number of reasons. One is because we have this overwhelming kind of belief that it's the government covering everything up. And secondly, because of the Will Smith, Tommy Lee Jones movie, which makes it all fun and they're just, normal guys who happen to work for a government agency. But when you read a lot of the reports, particularly in the work of people like John Keel, the work of people like Gray Barker, who incidentally took the Maury Island Incident, this is Gray Barker, and ran with it very heavily in his best-selling book and his probably most famous book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, where he was almost trying to replicate the Shaver mystery. He had this thing called the Bender mystery, where this ufologist in the early days of ufology had his kind of shut down his UFO research club because he'd been visited by 3 men in black. But in Bender's book, he talks about the Shaver mystery and he talks about the Maury Island Incident. He was very well acquainted with Ray Palmer. In fact, he used to write a column in one of Ray Palmer's magazines. So it all comes out of the same place. But as far as what I think they are, I think there is a kind of mythological trope or archetype to the appearance of a weird stranger dressed in black who's menacing and comes making threats which seem somehow to be paranormal or attached to the paranormal. I think there's a history going back hundreds, maybe even more years. As far as the UFO manifestation of it, if for a moment we imagine that Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman were hoaxing and their story wasn't true, that somehow they realized, they looked at Mount Rainier every day, Kenneth Arnold had all this attention, they thought, well, we'll tell our story, and, if it was somehow, and they both went on to say it was a hoax, particularly Harold Dahl, but then he retracted in another interview with the FBI and said, I just said it was a hoax because I wanted people to stop calling me crazy, so yeah. I'd rather be the hoaxer than the crazy guy. So anyway, again, it becomes so convoluted, it's so difficult to tell. But if for a moment we imagine that it is a hoax, as a lot of people say it is, then what really do we make of the beginning of the Men in Black story? If the first version of it's in a hoax and then it appears again, and again and again and again and again, is that somehow this idea entering the popular consciousness via Ray Palmer and Kenneth Arnold and, beating this drum, and then Gray Barker beating it again harder, or just as loud a few years later? Did it enter that way? But maybe even if it's not a hoax, maybe just did people talking about this so early in ufology? Again, we don't know about the Maury Island Incident very much now, unless we're seriously into UFO history, but early ufology certainly knew about the Maury Island Incident because, again, Ray Palmer was the main guy. He was Mr. UFO. He was the person who was, or Mr. Flying Saucer might be more accurate then. He's the person who had Flying Saucers magazine. He ran and started Fate magazine with Curtis Fuller. He was doing it in Amazing Stories beforehand. He was publishing multiple UFO books. Did that encounter, somehow punch so hard into popular consciousness that then there was an expectation, if you have a weird UFO encounter like Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman, you are going to get visited by a man in black who's going to make, strange, threatening, suggestions if you don't shush up? Because that's the beginning of the idea of the UFO silences, the idea of the Men in Black. It's so difficult to tell. Or was there always these people waiting? Or was the government agency, if you believe that version, were they trying to shut down, I don't know. But I do suspect, I really do, as much as I think about almost any of this stuff, I think when an idea enters the popular consciousness, whether it's Men in Black or whether it's Flying Saucers or whether it's Dogman or whether it's the Jersey Devil, as you mentioned before, I think these things almost take on a life of their own. I think they become a part of what we believe in. And I think therein lies perhaps the secret to all of this very, disparate phenomena. Perhaps it's just one phenomenon and it manifests the way we expect it to manifest. That's always so. Anyway, that's a very convoluted answer to your question. But my suspicion is somehow that what we believe impacts what we experience.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Like, I mean, you're definitely preaching to the choir on that front, because and I think we've seen that result in parapsychology studies over and over and over again, right? Just even in, and I've probably sound like a broken record to the audience, but back to even something as simple as the Ganzfeld experiments, where people who were completely resistant to this stuff had zero results or poor results, where the people who were hooked up, that were really open-minded, maybe didn't have an opinion on it, were having these interesting results where they were receiving images from somebody in another room, and they were able to identify stuff and remote view and do all this kind of a thing, and do things quite accurately. And I think that is such a telltale as to how a lot of this stuff works. I think when we are conscious of things around us, then we begin to see things in a different way. I think the universe has a funny way of bringing you things when you need them, and bringing you lessons when you need to see them. And I found that just throughout my career as well. Like, I don't know how many, decades I went before I ever saw anything remotely like a cryptid. Like, and I mean, I was out in the field for, holy crap, it was almost 20 years by the time I had my dogman encounters. But it was, I don't think prior to that I would have made sense of it in the way that I've made sense of it now. I had to hit a certain level of understanding. Not to say that I understand what the hell's going on, because I'm still asking questions. But I think there was a point at which I was like, you know what? Okay, everything is consciousness. We're not experiencing everything that we could possibly be experiencing. Having that openness, and then stuff starts to just kind of present itself into your experience. And like you talked about synchronicities, but before, that was another thing where it's like, I've had synchronicities show up that 100% are not coincidence. Like, stuff that is so far beyond, I'm sure if I repeated it, somebody in the padded truck would come and get me. But it's so wild that, I mean, there's no way to me that our consciousness is not influencing what we're experiencing, and there's some sort of co-creation going on. I think some sort of co-creation going on between what this phenomenon is and us. And I think, like what you talked about with the hotel room and all that, doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, I agree with you on the co-creation point. Greg Bishop wrote a wonderful essay in the late Robbie Graham's UFOs, reframing the debate about the nature of the UFO phenomenon seeming to indicate co-creation. And of course, other people have said very similar things, Jacques Vallée and John Keel and various others. I often wonder if the real value of studying the phenomenon isn't working out what the phenomenon or the phenomena, if it's all the same, is, but what it tells us about ourselves, what it tells us about being human.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the journey with this, whether it be ufology, whether it be hauntings, whether it be Dogman, whatever it is. I can attest to the fact that I have learned more about myself in how I'm interacting with this phenomenon than anything else. My Dogman encounters, which people who listen to the show know about, has taught me there's a new level of humility and love and respect for something that is often terrifying and people run from. And as most people that listen to the show know, I have a very deep love and affinity for them because I've had amazing experiences. But I think this stuff humbles you in a way, because you realize, A, you sure as shit don't know anything about anything that's going on, and B, it's a type of thing where the more you delve into that introspection and sort of start to clean yourself up, the more you get access to all of this. So yeah, I think it's phenomenal. Well, Dean, thank you so much for this. This has been amazing. incredible thing. And you've got an awesome documentary about Richard Shaver that has been winning so many awards over the last. But talk to people about that. Where can they find it? All of your information, all the research you're doing right now is phenomenal. So talk about that a little bit.
Sure, I'd love to, and thanks for the opportunity. So I have a short documentary, which is about 14 minutes, just called The Shaver Mystery. And I mentioned a little bit earlier in the show what The Shaver Mystery is about. It's essentially extracted from my upcoming feature documentary, The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers, which is about Raymond Palmer, Richard Shaver, and the creation of modern UFO belief. I have had a lot of luck with The Shaver Mystery short film on the festival circuit. It's screened at, a couple dozen fests and various cons and events now. It's won, I think, 8 Best Documentary Awards along with a bunch of other awards, which is really gratifying. And I think one of the reasons is it's such a strange story. And people have forgotten what was perhaps an origin story, well, certainly what I think was an origin story of modern UFO belief. It's still on the circuit. People can still, it's not available anywhere yet except on the festival circuit, and that's, again, the short film, The Shaver Mystery. It has a couple of upcoming screenings. It's at Genre Blast, which is in Virginia, and I think that festival runs August 29 to 31. I don't know yet if I will be there or not. I don't know yet if I'll be at Genre Blast or not. I will be at the following screening, which is September 19 to 20, the Friday and the Saturday. I'll also be doing a talk on The Shaver Mystery there, and that is at the Crossing Realms Conference, which is in Richmond, Virginia, which should be an awful lot of fun. There's all kinds of wonderful people there presenting and talking. So if anybody's anywhere near either of those events, I suggest you get along, not just to see my film, but to see either a bunch of other films or a bunch of other wonderful presenters. If you're interested, you can just go to theshavermystery.com. That's theshavermystery.com. That will currently just take you to the Facebook page, which is for both the short and the feature. And I always update what I'm doing with the feature because we're getting closer and closer. It's almost done now, where I've been working on it now for 2.5 years, but we're getting close. And it also always says where upcoming screenings of The Shaver Mystery short is.
It's so exciting. It's so good, and I can't wait to see where it takes you, because I don't think this is the end of the story. I think there's going to be more. I think there's stuff that's gonna show up along the way, and I'm excited for you, because I think this is the beginning of a very interesting journey. So again, thank you so much for doing this, and we're sending everybody over to the Talking Weird podcast, because it's so much fun and it's phenomenal, and there's so many cool people that come on, great discussions that we've had and that you've had with so many other amazing guests. So Dean, thank you so much.
Morgan, I can't thank you enough, and I always love talking to you. We've got to get you back on Talking Weird again sometime soon, because it's always so much fun.
When kids don't play, they grow up without creativity. They'll try to blend in and wear chinos, or worse, polyester chinos. Good thing Gushers Fruit by the Foot and Fruit Roll-Ups are made to be played with. You better be playing.
Introducing the new Volvo XC90 with 7-seat versatility, Google built-in, and advanced safety features for all your precious cargo. The new Volvo XC90, designed for life. Visit volvocars.com/US to learn more.
Eczema isn't always obvious, but it's real. And so is the relief from Ebglyss. After an initial dosing phase, about 4 in 10 people taking Ebglyss achieved itch relief and clear or almost clear skin at 16 weeks. And most of those people maintain skin that's still more clear at 1 year with monthly dosing.
Ebglyss, lebrikizumab LBKZ, a 250 milligram per 2 milliliter injection, is a prescription medicine used to treat adults and children 12 years of age and older who weigh at least 88 pounds or 40 kilograms with moderate to severe eczema, also called atopic dermatitis, that is not well controlled with prescription therapies used on the skin or topicals, or who cannot use topical therapies. Ebglyss can be used with with or without topical corticosteroids. Don't use if you're allergic to Ebglyss. Allergic reactions can occur that can be severe. Eye problems can occur. Tell your doctor if you have new or worsening eye problems. You should not receive a live vaccine when treated with Ebglyss. Before starting Ebglyss, tell your doctor if you have a parasitic infection.
Searching for real relief? Ask your doctor about Ebglyss and visit ebglyss.lilly.com or call 1-800-LILY-RX or 1-800-545-5979.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Checking off the boxes on your to-do list is a great feeling. And when it comes to checking off coverage, a State Farm agent can help you choose an option that's right for you. Whether you prefer talking in person, on the phone, or using the award-winning app, it's nice knowing you have help finding coverage that best fits your needs. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
What a cool conversation with Dean. He is so smart and so wonderful to talk to about this stuff. He is absolutely so full of knowledge. It's amazing. I learned a ton out of this. I mean, the Maury Island Incident is something that, like he was saying, many of the people steeped in ufology, probably many of you guys knew about this story. It was relatively new for me, mainly because I just don't delve too far into ufology like so many of you guys do. So this was so fascinating to learn and to hear about. And I don't know about you guys, but I've trouble believing that this was a complete hoax. You know, maybe elaborated in some ways and maybe exaggerated at some points. I mean, as most stories are, but I don't know. There's so many things that have happened since that really begin to verify a lot of what was experienced during this time period. And the fact that this place is such a hotspot and continues to be such a hotspot makes you really think that there's something to this story and that there's something going on. I'm always so interested to get to the root stories of where things begin, because I find that if you can find the origin point, then many things are revealed. We had Chris Auerbach on a couple of years ago who talked about the flying saucers and the Kenneth Arnold sighting, and how we wouldn't even have the term flying saucers today had it not been for the fact that the press got Kenneth Arnold's story wrong and it got his description wrong. And then all of a sudden everybody's seeing flying saucers basically because of a misprint in the media. And I find it just really interesting when you can get to the bottom of something, or if there is a bottom, and figure out where things have come from. One of the subjects that it has been very interesting to me, sort of leaving the topic of UFOs for a moment, has been the Wendigo and trying to find the bottom of that story. And I don't think anybody's been able to do that, which has been, again, very interesting. I brought up in this particular case, the Jersey Devil, and the roots of these stories, where often the story itself is preceded by an incident. And many times when we think about folklore and we think about stories like the Maury Island Incident, we think, okay, somebody made up the story and then everybody else started to see incidents and have things happen. But what's really interesting about things like the Jersey Devil is that when you go back far enough, you realize that people were experiencing something that the indigenous of the area called the Pine Barrens, the place of the dragon. And the story itself of Mother Leeds came as a attempt to explain the what these people were seeing, that there was something there and the stories came later. It wasn't the other way around, which I find is very, very interesting. And it makes you wonder about an incident like this, if that's indeed the case, somebody experienced the Men in Black and, the stories and the conspiracies came from just trying to explain what the heck was seen at Maury Island. So it's really interesting, and it's an interesting psychology to think about when we're trying to identify and figure out where some of these tales and things that we take for granted, stories we take for granted, have actually come from. It's really cool stuff. So I'm so glad that Dean was able to come on and get into this. It's so cool. And I hope it left you guys with as many questions as it did answers because, that's what this is supposed to do. So thank you for joining me on this eerie expedition, my dear listeners. And remember, there is no line between the natural and the supernatural. All is consciousness. Until next time, stay curious, friends. Supernatural Circumstances is a co-production of Entity Seeker, Paranormal Research and Teachings, and The 20th Plane. This podcast is a part of the Curious Cast podcast network. You can find out more about me, Morgan Knudsen, and book me for live appearances at entityseeker.ca. You can also email the show at supernaturalcircumstances.com.
New season, new chaos in college football.
Let's go! Big stage, big opportunity.
This Labor Day weekend, the wildness lives on ABC, ESPN, and the all-new ESPN app.
What a way to start!
Featuring top 10 teams like Clemson, Notre Dame, Alabama, and LSU, and Bill Belichick's debut at North Carolina.
It's so special when these teams collide.
Don't miss a lineup filled with electric matchups.
Welcome back to college football.
Kickoff week presented by Modelo. Labor Day weekend on ESPN and ABC. Also available to stream on the all-new ESPN app.